Dialectics is a dispute with oneself. Dialectics is one of the most traditional concepts in philosophy, addressed from the early stages of the formation of ancient thought and mentioned in almost all modern philosophy textbooks. Dialectics is not merely mentioned as an element of philosophy. Often, the idea of the identity of dialectics and philosophy is asserted. However, such assertions are usually presented as axioms, leaving behind a certain uncertainty about the subject of philosophy. There has never been a strict, universally accepted definition of what philosophy should study, and the uncertainty of dialectics itself. This creates a problem of uncertainty in the use of the term dialectics, because throughout the history of philosophy, different understandings of dialectics have existed, and the traditional reference to the original understanding of dialectics as a dialogue, conversation between two, is clearly insufficient. In contemporary philosophical literature, dialectics is defined as a modern method of scientific cognition, asserting that scientific cognition uses dialectical methods. However, what precisely constitutes the dialectical nature of scientific and philosophical cognition is considered briefly, with an indication that dialectics is the doctrine of contradictions. Therefore, it is necessary to highlight and express in clear terms the essence of the connection between contemporary dialectics and scientific cognition. Thus, the concept of dialectics has far from unambiguous content, and the history of the idea of dialectics goes through various stages, influencing both the development of understanding dialectics and the attitude towards it. Today, despite assurances from some authors about the importance of dialectical principles and concepts for modern science, not all researchers view dialectics positively. Quite often, dialectics is not only criticized, but also completely rejected, with such criticism often appearing superficial. My opinion is that dialectics is a crucial element in the creation of human intellect. Therefore, I set myself the task by turning to the main historical milestones in the development and disclosure of the idea of dialectics to try to identify its main points, constituting the logical content that receives various historical forms. The relevance of such research is largely determined by the noted popularity of using this term in contemporary philosophy. In addition, when considering the history of the idea of dialectics, it is important to assess its perspectives for both philosophy and science. Dialectics in ancient times. The examination of the historical development of the idea of dialectics is easiest to start with the main figure, Plato's understanding of dialectics. Generally, if we broadly represent the entire history of the development of dialectics, we can distinguish two peculiar peaks and one base. The peaks are Plato and Hegel, who developed dialectics, and the base is Karl Popper, specifically his famous article, "What is Dialectics?" I'll make a small digression. In my opinion, Hegel is the most important mind in understanding mass psychology, so I recommend everyone to read him. Let's continue. Usually, when talking about dialectics, special emphasis is placed on the role of Socrates, thanks to whom words like philosophy and dialectics gained wide currency in Greek culture. However, creating a term and creating a method are not the same thing. Therefore, not everyone in antiquity recognized Socrates as the creator of dialectics. For example, Aristotle considered Zeno the founder of dialectics, and for him, dialectics was a specific method. Specifically, the art of argumentation based on the criticism of commonly accepted beliefs or beliefs accepted by other thinkers, to expose them if they are false or insufficient. In our time, the question of evaluating Parmenides as the creator of dialectics has been addressed by Cornford, who proposed a conclusion according to which Parmenides is the first philosopher who argues, formally deducing conclusions from premises instead of making dogmatic statements. His school stood at the origins of dialectics. Not coincidentally, Parmenides is the main character in Plato's dialogue of the same name, in which, for the first time in the history of philosophy, a dialectical, logical analysis is provided. The reference to Parmenides, as we will see further, is not just a clarification of the history of the emergence of dialectics as a method on the philosophical stage, but also involves touching on the foundation of dialectics as a theory whose role in understanding the world is largely determined by Parmenides' initial assertion of the identity of being and thinking. Socrates referred to his method of philosophizing as dialectics, consciously and purposefully developing this method, distinguishing 3 stages: the purgative stage, purifying consciousness from false knowledge through the realization of I know nothing; the motivational stage, self-questioning, know thyself; and the epigogic stage, transitioning from specific truths to finding general truths and their ultimate ontological foundations. While the conversation in Socratic dialogue unfolds naturally, there is a process in it through which even someone lacking knowledge on a particular subject can test the understanding of the presumed expert. The check involves a series of questions related to the position the interlocutor is trying to defend. The Socratic method assumes that knowledge about any fact cannot be isolated. What is accepted as knowledge in the course of discussion must be based on more fundamental knowledge or ideas. Thus, to determine if a specific action is pious, one needs to know what piety is. This requirement gives the person asking the question the right to ask the respondent questions that are appropriately related to their initial inquiry. If a contradiction arises during this process, it becomes clear that the presumed expert ultimately lacks knowledge. If they possessed it, their understanding of the truth would have allowed them to avoid contradiction. While both Socrates and the skeptics hoped to find the truth, the method too often reveals only the inadequacy of the respondent. Even contemporaries of Socrates, notably his student Xenophon, admitted that dialectics was so named because those who practiced it in conversation divided things according to their classes. The understanding of dialectics, only hinted at by Socrates, is formalized in the works of Plato. He introduces the concept of dialectics, using it as a technical term alongside such conceptually close terms as dialectical art, dialectical ability, and dialectical method. It is with Plato that the transition from the prehistory of dialectics, understood as a specific form of Socratic conversation, to dialectics as one of the fundamental philosophical ideas takes place. This transition is expressed in Plato's philosophy through 2 interpretations of dialectics. The first understanding of dialectics is presented in early Platonic dialogues, where he portrays dialectics as the art of asking questions and providing answers. Such dialectics is associated with the name of Socrates and his polemics with the Sophists, appearing as skillful conversation aimed at finding the definition of a particular idea. This can be best described as an exercise in dialectics in the Aristotelian sense, useful primarily for training the mind, secondly for engaging with opponents on their own grounds, and finally for progress in philosophy itself. This is because the ability to address difficulties from both sides of the question facilitates the discovery of truth and errors in each case. It is in this sense that Plato's Parmenides states that such exercises are necessary if truth is not to escape Socrates. The second significance of dialectics in Plato lies in the necessity and ability to think correctly, that is, to be able to see individual things in the light of a unified idea. Canto Sperber identifies two procedures in Plato's dialectical method. The first involves bringing numerous things under the unity of an idea, embracing everything with a common glance, bringing together under a single idea what is scattered everywhere. The second involves the analysis and division of being into as many possible small components. Starting from the idea, it is necessary to divide everything into kinds, into natural components, trying not to fragment any of them. A deeper understanding of dialectics in Plato carries an explicitly ontological character, as correct thinking presupposes the operation with concepts revealing the essence of things. The essence of things in Plato's teachings is determined by a special reality, the world of ideas. Here, dialectics opens new perspectives for the thinker, or more precisely, the philosopher, who, according to Plato's intention outlined in his famous Republic, should rule. The philosopher must rule because he alone possesses genuine knowledge, and genuine knowledge is dialectics, leading to knowledge, the only way to grasp what truly exists. The subject of dialectics as a special science is the ability to understand various relationships between concepts. Engaging in dialectics means identifying identity and difference among the truly existent through reasoning, as done in the dialogue Sophist. Accordingly, from a formal standpoint, the dialectical process is twofold, involving synthesis, or union followed by division, and Plato adhered to this method throughout his life. Guthrie emphasizes that the most important rule is that the divisions used in dialectics must correspond to reality, that is, ontological differences between the form understood as the eidos and the form corresponding only to part of a broader genus. However, dialectics is not only the operation with genuine knowledge embodied in the realm of ideas, but also the procedure of elevating a sensually perceived multitude to a single concept or idea, expressing its semantic unity and serving as a goal pattern. Mochalova suggests distinguishing between ideas and concepts in Plato to evaluate the connection between the development of Plato's dialectics and his understanding of the world of ideas, with the defining moment being this distinction. The difference lies in the fact that ideas, being true being, are superior to concepts, that is, mentally apprehensible likenesses of ideas. Therefore, concepts, being finite and limited, as the essence of a concept is its determinateness or limitation, are determined through their opposition. In short, ideas in their existence do not require opposition, whereas a concept requires its opposite. In the end, realizing the fundamental difference between ideas and concepts leads Plato to change the status of dialectics. He restricts dialectics as the art of thinking to the realm of concepts only, which in turn requires a more careful development of it as a method of operating with concepts. In later dialogues, especially in the Republic, a new understanding of the application of dialectics emerges, aspiring not only to ask questions, but also to turn to genuine being, to a presupposition-free beginning. Plato, for a comprehensive exploration of the question of correctness of names, fully utilizes the dialogical form. This allows him to present opposing theories, demonstrating that none of them is entirely correct, and to conclude only the necessity for further contemplation. Throughout all discussions involving Socrates, his own convictions flicker among those he deems absurd. The choice of the status of names as the subject had a dual reason. Firstly, it was a recent topic of debate among the Sophists, where he could expose their errors with his favorite blend of seriousness and humor, and secondly, it influenced his cherished doctrine of forms. It's worth emphasizing Gatry's suggestion of the connection between Plato's Dialectics and the confusing of listeners, allowing him to present opposing views. The question arises, why does Plato need this? A possible answer, recalling that Plato's favorite form of expression is myth, dialectics, with its presentation of opposites and confusing interlocutors, proves very suitable for conveying a myth. Dialectics in antiquity is a search for truth. But what if, during the discussion, the presented positions are criticized, contradictions are revealed, and none of the opponent's statements proves to be true? If we only critique a particular definition or statement, we engage in purely negative work. Therefore, dialectics cannot be reduced solely to exposing contradictions, a reduction that is somewhat alive even today. In Plato's early dialogues, dialectics is the art of questioning and answering, inherited from Socrates. The goal of such dialectics is to determine the essence under investigation, eidos. If we limit ourselves to the Socratic understanding of dialectics as conducting a dialogue by presenting specific statements, revealing contradictions through questions, and subsequently abandoning those statements, turning to new ones, the main question remains unclear. Where does the truth come from? However, a new aspect of dialectics emerges later. Plato emphasizes the need to ascend to genuine being, to a presupposition-free beginning, avoiding the confusion created by zealous disputants. Therefore, in understanding the role of dialectics in Plato, it is crucial to highlight its ontological aspect. Dialectics, through questions, reveals contradictions in the interlocutor's arguments, but does not stop there. Dialectics is not only the art of conducting a conversation, but also a philosophical investigation according to the nature of the subject studied, aimed at revealing the essence of being. Dialectics is not just enthusiasm in reasoning, but truly a method of understanding being. Thus, according to Plato, the goal of dialectics is the discovery of ideas and their interconnections. Dialectics becomes a way of grasping ideas, that is, the essence of things. The importance of emphasizing the ontological aspect of Plato's dialectics is linked to a fundamental tenet of modern dialectics criticism, primarily in the works of Popper, the insistence on the exclusively logical character of dialectics. Turning to the ancient stage of the development of the idea of dialectics shows that Popper criticizes a limited understanding of dialectics. Thus, Plato's dialectics is directly connected to his doctrine of ideas. Ideas represent the highest reality, and dialectics is the only way to grasp what truly exists, that is, ideas. In ancient culture, dialectics was valued by Plato's contemporaries and subsequent generations. In the academy, dialectics was one of the main subjects of education, fostering student skills in argumentation, the ability to defend their theses, and identify the weaknesses in an opponent's position. In other philosophical schools, dialectics was also understood as the skill to solve dialectical problems, the use of which allowed one to refute the interlocutor, demonstrating one's superiority in the art of argument. I would like to specifically note Aristotle's approach to dialectics. Since Aristotle did not adopt his teacher's position regarding the independent existence of entities, ideas, his understanding of dialectics differs from Plato's. According to Aristotle, dialectics only provides probable knowledge, whereas for Plato, it provides true knowledge. The role of dialectics in philosophical understanding, according to Aristotle, lies, firstly, in purifying knowledge from erroneous statements. Secondly, dialectics explores the principles of all knowledge by examining the contradictions and difficulties arising in their relation. And thirdly, dialectics is a special method of investigation and acquiring new knowledge based on dialectical syllogisms. As these consistent conclusions are based on opinions accepted on faith, they can only yield probable, albeit non-contradictory, conclusions. Thus, the idea of dialectics, in the philosophical sense, not every thought or statement in philosophy can claim the status of an idea. A true idea is a thought capable of generating an infinite number of other thoughts, is formalized only by Plato, and receives several meanings and interpretations. The first is dialectics as the art of asking questions and providing answers. The second is the ability to see individual things in the light of a unified idea. The realization of this ability is linked to the dialectician's mastery of the skill to divide and unite things and concepts. Historically, the first sense of Platonic dialectics as the art of asking questions takes center stage, and during the subsequent Middle Ages, what was valued most in dialectics and constituted its subject was the clarification of the power of words. What is now considered central to our understanding of dialectics from the 19th century onwards, namely the idea of development, is only indirectly present in Plato, as the development of the process of seeking truth through questions and answers, revealing contradictions in the initial statements of interlocutors. This is because, for Plato, ideas are understood as eternal and unchanging essences. Accordingly, talking about the development of ideas is impossible. They exist all at once. However, there is still a connection between Plato and Hegel's dialectics, the connection of all ideas in the light of a unified idea, the idea of the good, in Plato's teachings. Hegel's view on dialectics. The idea of development holds a central place in Hegel's philosophy. Referring to the history of the formation of the idea of dialectics, Hegel notes that the dialectics of Socrates and Plato represent an analysis and refutation of limited assertions, that is, subjective dialectics, as contradictions here belong to statements and not to the investigated essences. Hegel's own dialectics, however, is objective, as opposites and contradictions are inherent in reality itself. Nevertheless, Plato's teachings have a direct relationship to Hegelian dialectics in the sense that both involve the objectivity of ideas. Hegel's dialectics is a doctrine of the development of the reality of concepts. Absolute idea, absolute reason, absolute spirit, these are different aspects of one logical reality, the self-development of which determines the development of nature and history. In his philosophy, Hegel completes the development of the main ideas and problems of German classical philosophy, and his dialectics, essentially the dialectics of reason, relies on Kant's ideas about reason. Understanding determines and firmly holds definitions. Reason, on the other hand, is negative and dialectical because it turns the definitions of understanding into nothingness. It is positive because it produces the universal and comprehends the particular. It should be clarified that Kant also speaks of the dialectical nature of reason in connection with the discovery of inherent antinomies and contradictions. But for Kant, contradictions are limitations that should be eliminated both from knowledge and reality. For him, dialectics is the logic of appearance. According to Hegel, dialectical nature is inherent in reality itself, and consists of constant movement and development, occurring by negating the previous stages of development. Development is the process of revealing the concept, discovering its inherent contradiction, and resolving this contradiction. However, Hegel's doctrine of dialectics is not presented strictly and unambiguously. There are quite complex points that give rise to different interpretations of his dialectics. This raises the complex issue of the historical paths of accepting and interpreting Hegelian dialectics. We will only note one essential aspect for understanding the essence of dialectics: the presence of two meanings of dialectics in Hegel. Dialectics, in the narrow sense, is the doctrine of negativity, while dialectics in the broad sense is the doctrine of opposites. The problem lies in the fact that contradictions and opposites are far from being the same. One cannot be substituted for the other. However, such a substitution is often inherent in various interpreters of Hegel, giving rise to numerous questions and sharp assessments of dialectics as such. In Hegel's philosophy, dialectics appears, firstly, as the doctrine of opposites, a method of cognition, and secondly, as the doctrine of development, the doctrine of reality. Although these understandings coexist in Hegel's exposition, all actuality contains within itself opposite determinations, and the comprehension of the object in concepts signifies knowledge of it as the concrete unity of opposites. Hegel's contribution to the understanding of dialectics, to the development of the idea of dialectics, primarily lies in his understanding of the world as a process of development. However, it is crucial to remember that for Hegel, the world is the absolute idea. The world of things is secondary. It is the result of the self-development of the original idea, and this process has an internal character. That is, development occurs as a result of revealing and resolving internal contradictions of concepts. Contradictions are inherent in the concept because there is no isolated concept separated from everything else. Each concept is connected with other concepts, and any concept is a determination, meaning it has boundaries, is fixed, and boundaries always imply limitations. Therefore, there are no frozen concepts or definitions. Instead, there is a process of self-understanding of the original absolute idea. This process has a dialectical nature, encompassing three crucial moments. The first moment is the moment of understanding, a moment of fixation where concepts or forms have what seems to be a stable definition. The second moment is the dialectical or negatively rational moment, a moment of instability. In this moment, one-sidedness or limitation in the definition highlighted in the moment of understanding comes to the forefront, and the definition fixed in the first moment transitions into its opposite. Hegel describes this process as a process of sublation or self-annihilation. The verb sublate is a key concept in his dialectical method. Hegel says that aufheben has a double meaning. It simultaneously means to cancel or negate and to preserve. The moment of understanding sublates itself because its own character or nature, its one-sidedness or limitation, destabilizes its definition, leading to a transition into its opposite. Thus, the dialectical moment involves a process of self-annihilation, or a process in which the definition from the moment of understanding negates itself, or simultaneously cancels and preserves itself as it moves towards its opposite or transitions into it. The third moment is the speculative or positively rational moment, which captures the unity of opposition between the first two definitions, or is the positive result of the dissolution or transition of these definitions. The word moment should be understood literally, as these moments are not separated in time, but are present simultaneously, instantaneously, in dialectical thinking. Briefly, these three moments are outlined in educational literature in the form of the well-known scheme thesis, antithesis, synthesis. A vast amount of literature is dedicated to the exposition and interpretation of Hegel's teachings, and our task does not include a detailed examination of his dialectics. We are interested in how he influenced the understanding of the idea of dialectics and how this understanding affected the attitude towards the idea of dialectics. To briefly answer the first point, Hegel's contribution to the development of the idea of dialectics lies in considering dialectics as dialectical thinking, where the subject of this thinking is not just or primarily a human, but the absolute. Since everything existing, including nature and history, is the result of this dialectical thinking, Hegel seeks to reveal the essence of this thinking. In the end, it turns out that thinking encompasses understanding and reason, as shown by Kant, with rational concepts being relative and contradictory. Reason is negative and dialectical because it turns the determinations of the understanding into nothingness. It is positive because it produces the universal and comprehends the particular within it. Hegel emphasizes the universality of dialectics, stating that the dialectical is, in general, the principle of all movement, all life, and all activity in the sphere of reality. Hegel's contribution to the development of dialectics also lies in his elaboration of fundamental concepts and principles such as quality and quantity, essence and appearance, form and content, and so on. It's worth noting that the famous laws of Hegelian dialectics are not exactly Hegel's laws, but those of one of his famous followers, Engels. As for the second point, attitudes toward Hegel's understanding of dialectics, briefly, we can highlight the following. In Hegel's teachings, key concepts such as development, historicity, and negativity were recognized. Everything in the world evolves, has its history, cannot be eternal, and is in constant motion. The movement itself, of thought, history, etc., occurs in the form of collision, negation, and reconciliation of opposites. Critique and modern life of dialectics. Hegel's teachings are often called the pinnacle of dialectics, not only because he brought the problematic of dialectics to a new level, but also because after him, the development of dialectics came to a halt. Although in official literature, Marx and Engels' reference to Hegelian dialectics was evaluated not just as a continuation and development of dialectics, but as the creation of a higher level known as dialectical materialism. Nevertheless, there was no development of the idea of dialectics in the works of the founders of Marxism, although there was an interpretation of dialectics, including the correction of Hegel, replacing his idealism with materialism. As a result, dialectical contradictions in thought became secondary, only reflecting the dialectical contradictions of objective reality. Dialectical materialism was not only a background, but thanks to its dialectical nature, it was not rigid, although many positions of dialectical materialism provide grounds for such an assessment. The dialectical nature here is essentially the acknowledgement of the active role of some ideal principle that, through contradictions, influences matter. For the sake of fairness, it should be noted that there is no consensus on the evaluation of Marx and Engels' dialectics even today. there are both defenders and rejectors. As for the critique of the idea of dialectics, central importance is given to Karl Popper, a British philosopher of science, who, in 1937, published an article titled, "What is Dialectic?" However, this does not mean that active discussions of dialectical ideas took place in the 1930s. Interest in dialectics, especially in its Hegelian variant, emerged later in Western thought, particularly in the 1960s, when the issues of the philosophy of science were being formulated, and attention turned to dialectics as a method of scientific knowledge. Popper, from a positivist standpoint, asserted that the only true scientific method for him was trial and error. His critique primarily targeted the central point of dialectics, the acknowledgement of contradictions. The most serious misunderstandings and muddles arise from the vagueness characteristic of dialecticians' reasoning about contradictions. Popper advocated for formal logic, where the presence of contradiction in thinking is a sign of error. His main concern was that by applying universally valid rules of inference, any conclusion can be derived from a pair of contradictory premises. Popper then addressed the famous dialectical triad, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. According to Popper, this scheme works only when dealing with a single initial idea, whereas the interpretation in terms of trial and error is somewhat more flexible than the interpretation in terms of dialectics. It is not confined to situations where it is suggested to start with a single thesis, and therefore it easily applies where several theses are put forward from the outset, independently of each other, and not necessarily in opposition. Popper pointed out, and on this point it is hard not to agree with him, that dialectics often uses metaphors too frequently and too literally. How did Popper's critique influence the development of the idea of dialectics? It's challenging to provide a definitive answer. Some dialectical materialism supporters dismissed this critique as lightweight, while others partially accepted it. However, even if Popper's understanding of dialectics is considered too narrow and one-sided, his main focus being on the criticism of Marx rather than Hegel, he raised questions that demanded clarification. At the very least, this resulted in an effort to clarify the status of dialectical logic and an awareness of the closure of Hegel's dialectics. Hegel's teachings and his dialectics represent a self-contained world, and it cannot be easily transferred to the world of nature and history as we know it, nor can it be criticized from an external perspective. The stumbling block in evaluating both dialectics and its critique remains the fundamental assumption underlying dialectics as a theory of development, the implicit acceptance of the identity of being and thinking. Recognizing the source of the development of opposites, their struggle, one must consider the logical nature of contradictions. If the logical becomes a factor influencing the physical, the real, it is only possible through acknowledging the identity of being and thinking. Conclusions. Dialectics as a theory of development emerges in the history of thought as a result of the discovery of the variability of the world and the necessity of reflecting this variability in the process of cognition. Furthermore, the idea of dialectics, understood as a method, expresses the contradictory nature of the process of cognition and thinking, highlighting two aspects: the contradiction of cognition and the discovery of opposites in the cognizable realities. The idea of dialectics, expressed by Plato and Hegel, requires seeking and finding the one, according to Plato, or the universal according to Hegel, behind individual things, properties, concepts, and definitions. Seeing the unified connections of opposite moments is an enduring idea of dialectics, which cannot be abandoned if we attempt to think and understand the world. The relevance of this idea, open since ancient times, remains today as a requirement not to stop at the level of already fixed and conceptually expressed properties and relationships of objects, but to strive for overcoming conceptual limitations and reaching new levels of meaning. The discovery of new levels and types of realities, including virtual reality, complex nonlinear systems, etc., in principle allows the emergence of a new non-classical dialectics as a method of non-classical science, posing new challenges for dialectics. In particular, the fundamental question about the source of development remains open, as logical contradiction cannot be the cause of physical movement. Moreover, the universal concept of development as a particular case of movement, namely the transition from lower to higher, does not yet exist. In the end, it is hardly worth abandoning dialectics in philosophy and scientific knowledge altogether. Still, while preserving it as a working tool of thought and cognition, one must consider the accumulated problems. These problems are related to the different meanings in understanding dialectics and the difficulty of drawing boundaries between the logical and the physical.